All right, so the main hope for Module 3 is that you'll learn a little bit more about validity and reliability when it comes to single system design. I'll give you some examples, and as we move on, I'll talk a little bit more about specifying problems and goals. Validity is a rather big concept when it comes to single system design and really anything to do with measurement. Validity is whether or not an instrument measures what it's supposed to be measuring, really, and it's ultimately the accuracy of the measure. A measure may be reliable, but if it's not measuring what it's supposed to, then it's not really effective. Later in this module, we'll be talking about the difference between reliability and validity. And just because a measurement is reliable and consistently measuring the same thing in the same way doesn't necessarily mean it's measuring the right thing. So a measure can be reliable but not valid, but it can't be valid and not reliable, because if it's measuring what it's intended to, then you should get similar results every time. So an example may be if you're using head circumference to measure intelligence, it's going to be a reliable measure. Somebody's head circumference is going to stay the same, and every time you measure it, it's going to be reliable because you're going to get the same measurement each time that you measure head circumference. But that doesn't mean that you're really getting at a good measurement of intelligence, because it's not really an accurate measure, and head size really doesn't have too much to do with intelligence. So regarding validity, in order for a measurement to be valid, it must come as close to the bullseye of the concept as possible. So you could think about shooting an arrow at a target, and the closer to the center, or like the ideal measure as possible, then we would have close to perfect validity. So an example here, if we were looking at these three arrows, they all represent different client readiness change measures. So which one would be the most valid? The one that was closest to the bullseye on the bottom. We may have some measurements in social science that come really close to hitting the bullseye, but not quite. So we have different ways of assessing whether or not we have valid, accurate measures. And validity, there's a few different types of validity. Worth noting, face validity is whether or not a measure is valid on its face, whether it seems to be valid in measuring what it's intended to. Content validity has more to do with measuring the whole spectrum of what makes up that construct that we're trying to measure. So if we're measuring somebody's personality, we would probably need quite a few items to get at that whole construct, because it's such a complex, multifaceted social construct. Criterion validity often has to do with the measure's predictive traits. So often you think about criteria of maybe like student performance. So does the ACT and the SAT really have criteria validity? Can it really predict future performance? And construct validity is really whether or not the measurement's getting at the construct that we're hoping to really measure, the underlying construct that we're trying to get at. So some problems when it comes to validity are systematic measurement error, a tendency to err in a particular direction. Sometimes people can want to be perceived in a certain way. So we have something called measurement reactivity, or the Hawthorne effect. So people might be less likely to share something that would portray them in a less positive light. There's also random measurement error, which is a little bit different in that we really can't control for it so much as practitioners. With random measurement error, maybe you're doing a single system design to help improve somebody's mood, and right before they come into your office, it's storming outside, or they get into a fender bender on the way in, or something like that. Random measurement errors might lead you to believe that your intervention is not effective, whereas it might be. So with testing validity, if we're looking at like content or face validity, and you were putting together a measure, if you're looking at marital satisfaction, for instance, if you're looking at a measure of marital satisfaction, the question should really be related to the quality of your marriage and your relationship and closeness, satisfaction, whatever it may be. And also should have some type of content validity and making sure that it's asking the right kind of questions. So child maltreatment, it might not just be one component. It could be verbal aggression, physical aggression, neglect, a whole plethora of different behaviors that could lead up to child maltreatment. So criterion validity is the ability of a measure to predict an individual's performance, like mentioned before, potentially college performance or academic performance. Concurrent validity means that if there's a second measure, maybe like the ACT and the SAT, if somebody were to perform well on one, it should be concurrent with their performance on another one. So that's at one point in time. So if somebody scored excellent on the SAT, they should also score excellent on the ACT. versus predictive validity, which would be if they scored excellent on the ACT, they should do really well in college later down the line. So it should predict future behavior. So when you're selecting a standardized measure, and a lot of people will do that for the single system design, it's good to have an idea of what's a guide to validity estimates. So if you see something above 0.9, it's very good validity. 0.81 to 0.9 is good, and so on and so forth. You can read these yourself. But it's good to look through the published norms of any kind of standardized measures before using them to make sure that they're up to snuff with kind of like quality expectations of the field. So now that we covered validity, reliability is less to do with accuracy and more to do with consistency of the measure. So reliability is an indicator of the extent to which a measure contains random measurement error. So again, random measurement error is an error that we really can't control. So an example of random measurement error is if a client completes a measure of stress, how could the client's current mood impact how they completed the measure? And certainly mood is something that fluctuates pretty regularly. There can be changes of mood from minute to minute for some people, or even faster than that from what I've seen in my clinical practice, versus something that might be more consistent over time, such as personality traits, or even more consistent than that is probably IQ. So if reliability is consistency, unreliability is inconsistency of measurement due to measurement errors, which is what we want to avoid. So if we're coming together with a measurement, some system errors could be people not understanding how to complete the form and filling it out wrong, or filling out a questionnaire wrong every time they do it, which is going to lead to a whole lot of error and making our measures less accurate and less reliable, really. So in order to test reliability, it's generally determined by repeatedly measuring the independent variable. And if we're going to be using a standardized measure, it would be the same people under the same circumstance. So if you were to measure intelligence, you might give somebody an intelligence test now and maybe 5 years down the road and see how consistent their responses are, or how consistent their score is. Similarly to the different types of validity, there's different types of reliability. So test-retest reliability is just as it sounds, testing the stability or consistency of a measure by calculating the correlation between a first and a second administration. So the stronger the correlation of scores from the first administration to the second administration, the higher the test-retest reliability. And similar to validity, the closer to 1 would be perfect reliability. So if I'm pretty tall, so if I were 6'6" now, I should probably be 6'6" next year. And that would probably be a pretty close to perfect test-retest correlation. Versus my weight this year versus my body weight next year. It's probably going to be pretty close, maybe not perfect, because I don't know. There's a whole variety of reasons why you gain and lose some body weight, which is a little bit less stable than height, which is pretty consistent throughout most of your adult life. And this little animation here talks about maybe two concepts that are completely separate and no correlation whatsoever, versus like maybe a 0.5 correlation where they share half of their variance, versus a perfect 0.1 correlation. Like this could be like test-retest reliability of height from one year to the next. So again, when selecting standardized measures, the following are good guidelines for estimating reliability. So gun above 0.9 is very good, 0.81 to 0.9 is good, and so on again. Another form of reliability is internal consistency reliability, which is the extent to which people respond consistently to items contained in the measure. So if all the items in a measure are meant to measure the same construct, maybe if you had a measure of anxiety, for instance, the Beck Anxiety Index, all those items should be correlated pretty closely to one another. A statistical way of doing this is the coefficient alpha, which is a statistical method that looks at the relationships amongst all different variables within a scale. And then it spits out a number. There's ways to do this by hand, but typically done by computer, that looks at the correlation of all items and the respondents' responses to those. So again, the higher the number, the higher the level of internal consistency, with a perfect 1 being the highest level of Cronbach alpha, which you'll probably never see. So here from this example, the sexual experience questionnaire measures sexual harassment in the workplace, and it's reported to have alpha rating range from 0.78 to 0.88. So would you use this with your client, kind of based on the previous slide? I would say that would be acceptable or good even. Okay, so another form of reliability is inter-rater reliability. And this is something you can think of like almost like you would see in the Olympics. You're not going to have a lone wolf rating a performance. You're going to have multiple people rating the performance, and they should be pretty consistent with one another. So inter-rater reliability can be viewed in the social world too. So whether it's qualitative observations or if two people were going to give an intelligence test to somebody, if two different psychologists gave the same IQ test to the same patient, both of their scores or intelligence quotient rating should converge pretty closely to kind of come up with a really similar score. And so when looking at test reliability, you would take the number of agreements over the total number of observations times 100 to come up with your result. And again, similar standards for test reliability here when looking at observer agreements. And I'm going to post a video with the question to the discussion forum on test or inter-observer reliability. Try to check out the video and tell me how many times that you think there's an open-ended question versus a closed-ended question. And once everybody posts, we can do some comparison to see if we all came up with the same thing. All right, so on to the discussion of validity and reliability. So how do we know the truth of the client situation? How do we know that we've got a valid, accurate measurement? Sometimes you might have to check in with the client to see what their feeling is. Sometimes you might have to turn to research. Depending on cultural considerations, you might want to factor that into your results as well. What's the relationship between reliability and validity? Again, if we have something that's measuring what it's meant to measure and it's measuring it accurately, we should be getting reliable, consistent results every time as well. And what's your thoughts about a newly term coined client validity, which is kind of like a newer term in the field of whether or not the client believes that the measure is accurate from their perspective. And it's something that we think about. And in single system design, we might want to question whether or not the client views that we're really measuring what we are. So kind of taking off our hat as the expert and kind of checking in with them to see if we are measuring what we're intending to measure, or if they feel like that we are. Okay, so for your single system design, you're going to be filling out a goals table. So it's important to know how to come up with specifying problems and goals. So the first step in specifying a client concern is just kind of straight up asking, what brought you in here today? What kind of problems are you viewing is yourself having? And then the second step is to perform a multidimensional assessment of that problem. So it can be more formal assessment, like pulling out the DSM or pulling out like a PHQ-9 or something more formal to assess that problem. Sometimes it's doing like a structured clinical interview. So once you've got a good conceptual definition, you're going to move on to operationally defining the client problem. And an operational definition of a client's problem is in measurable terms, and that becomes the target of your intervention. This will lead you to coming up with verifying sources of the operationally defined problem. So a verifying source can include a significant other, a coworker, agency records. It's basically like a triangulation. So instead of just taking the client's word for it, you'd be looking for other sources of data that would either give you convergent validity to say that these observations are in fact true, or if they diverge in some way, you can follow up with the client to say, hey, you know, the data that I have from your friend or coworker or roommate is really not jiving with what you're telling me, and I'm wondering if you can help me understand that. So step 5 in specifying client outcomes is how will you do it, to what extent, and under what conditions. So specifying which outcomes and intermediate goals. So let's say if you're going to be operationally defining number of cigarettes smoked per day, you might want to come up with an intermediate goal of decreasing cigarettes smoked by 50% from your baseline average, or maybe 75% from the baseline average. And then step 7 is to specify any client facilitative goals. So things that are going to help you to get to the outcome that you're really hoping for. Whether that be buying nicotine gum or joining an exercise club or whatever it may be, helping you to facilitate your intervention. And then lastly, step 8 is specifying the intervention methods as linked to the problem. And I would say for your personal project, this isn't as big of a deal coming up with an intervention, but in the real world, I would like you to be able to come up with an intervention that is evidence-based and you can easily apply to your client, and that's been shown to be effective for the client problem that they're presenting with. So just to break down the difference between facilitative, intermediate, and outcome goals, if we're working backwards here, if your outcome goal is the last bullet point, the client is trying to secure safe, affordable housing, and that's your outcome. Maybe a facilitative goal to get there is to get them the transportation they need to attend job interviews, and an intermediate goal might be to take their recovery from narcotics day by day. So you can kind of see like steps along the way to the outcome goal and kind of clarifying those within your SSD.